Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Nason Mahboubi, the director of the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations, and I am delighted to introduce the trade and competitiveness team of our project to you today. This webinar is part of a series of 6 webinars we're doing through the end of February, in which the fellows from the second cohort of project fellows of our project will be presenting the papers that they've been developing in our project over the course of the past year. The process of the development of these papers has included their presenting very early drafts on campus at the University of Pennsylvania back in May of last year, has included presenting the drafts to Chinese interlocutors in Beijing back in July, when we were also doing field work on the different topics of these papers, has included presenting further developed drafts to policymakers in Washington, D.C. in September. And now we are sharing what are still working papers with the general public and discussing them in these webinars. Based on the feedback from these discussions, the authors will go ahead and further revise their papers, their findings and recommendations, and we will publish a final report featuring all of the fellows of the second cohort later this spring. I'm absolutely thrilled by the quality of the papers generally, and especially of this group discussing trade and competitiveness issues. Let me invite them all to come up on stage so I can introduce them and we can get today's conversation started. Fellows in this group include Martin Chorzempa from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., Zongyuan Zoe Liu from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and Huan from China Trade Monitor, I believe in Washington, D.C. And the moderator for today's program is Mark Wu, professor of law at Harvard Law School and director of the Fairbanks Center for China Studies, an old friend of mine as well, and we were both fellows in the first cohort of fellows of the Penn Project. Mark, I am absolutely thrilled that you have time to moderate today's discussion, and I can't wait to hear the questions you pose and the discussion that it elicits. Let me hand it over to you, and I will be back at the end of the program.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and welcome to everyone who's watching this online. I think the topic of trade and competitiveness leads very little in terms of introduction. It certainly has been a core issue at the heart of U.S.-China relations, including the managed competition between Beijing and Washington. But let me take a few minutes just to sort of set the stage. I think if we think about where we are today compared to where we were 8 years ago at the start of the first Trump administration, but even 4 years ago at the start of the Biden administration, the debate and conversation has shifted quite a bit. I think it goes to say without a doubt that the world, not just the United States, is focused on not just simply the effects of the first China shock, but also now the current effects of the second China shock. The debate has gone from thinking about how do we engage with China on economic issues and how do we change China's economic structure towards one, accepting that China is going to make its own choices about the future of its own economic structure, and the United States and its allies needing to shape a set of policies in response to that. Those policies debate has ranged from thinking about some degree of use of tariffs and strategic decoupling to de-risking, which is the preferred term in Brussels and in Tokyo, amongst other allies, towards one of a much more full-throttled decoupling so as to lower the risks. I think everyone here recognizes that these policies come with some degree of economic costs, but that these are necessary costs to bear in mind, given the need to achieve greater strategic resiliency, but also to think about rebuilding America's industrial base, and particularly its focus on manufacturing and its defense industrial complex. It also is part of the debate that the tools here have expanded to think not only about tariffs or the use of sanctions, but now a whole range of issues, including technology controls, data controls, export controls. And now increasingly, the debate has also shifted towards technology and thinking about AI, which will be the focus of another webinar here as well. I want to start the conversation by first highlighting the fact that along with Meg Rithmeyer and Matt Furchin, I had the privilege of serving in the first cohort of fellows on trade competitiveness, and we put out a set of recommendations 4 years ago at the start of the Biden administration. Those recommendations emphasized a need to work with allies and strategic partners. It emphasized the need to work through bilateral and regional fora to de-emphasize a focus on the WTO. It emphasized the need to rebuild back home and to strengthen America's own defense, as well as its own industrial competitiveness. It also emphasized the need to focus on actual rather than imagined national security threats, and to structure the economic competition through established institutions, including CFIUS, the Commerce Department, and the like. Finally, it emphasized the need for a whole of a society or whole of government approach, but one that included not just government itself, but also the business community, civil society, and a focus on making sure that the competition also focused on what was happening economically in developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So if that were the set of recommendations, I would say, right, based on what's transpired over the last 4 years, I think the Biden administration has carried out many of these recommendations. So I just want to start the conversation by asking our second cohort of fellows to grade those of us who were in the first cohort. Based on those policies, do you believe that America is in a better place than it was 4 years ago in terms of its competitiveness, its trade policy, its resiliency, and its ability to compete with China? And the second question I'll just pose just to start this out, where are the blind spots that perhaps we missed 4 years ago? Why don't I start by asking Huan if you want to take a first crack at those questions?
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And I was very honored to be part of the second cohort. And to answer your question, has the Biden administration done a good job in following the recommendations of the first cohort in terms of strengthening its competitiveness and de-risking? I think there are certainly a lot of effort have been made. Let me begin with that. We saw some of the efforts is really a joint action between the Biden administration and Congress, right? So, well, in the past 4 years, we saw a lot of efforts in de-risking the supply chain, so working on how to strengthen our supply chains. So in 2021, the Biden administration issued an executive order on America's supply chains, right, and calling for agencies to identify any risk in the supply chains for critical minerals and strategic minerals across multiple sectors, not just in defense and semiconductor, but pharmaceuticals, energy, transportation, and food, and so on. So I think there are, and then we subsequently we saw agencies, produce reports. So, I would say the Biden administration was really, working on identifying, vulnerabilities in the supply chains and trying to come up with proactive ways to address these kind of vulnerabilities. And this is also effort not just by, not just a unilateral effort, but we're seeing the U.S. has been team up with other allies and partners. A lot of efforts took place in the past, 4 years. We saw a lot of discussions about supply chain resilience in U.S., EU, TTC, G7, a lot of these kind of different initiatives with allies and partners. And so I think there are certainly trying to work, use all resources possible to trying to adjust our supply chain to make it to de-risk any potential risk. So I do think that there are have to give the Biden administration's credit on working on those parts. And in addition to this kind of critical mineral supply chains, we also saw a lot of works on related to forced labor in our supply chains, and also we saw the Biden administration come out with rules on connected vehicles. So those are all the work that's been done by the Biden administration. I do feel like it's important to assess, to look at all different initiatives that we had at different platforms or forums, and identified areas for improvement, and perhaps like to extend the reach of these kind of initiatives to more emerging economies in say Asia and Latin America. And I also feel like while this whole effort of de-risking it's across all sectors, as I mentioned that in the executive order. I do feel like the focus or the priorities should be given to the military and defense sector, as they are at the forefront, not just that voluntarily we want to de-risk, but also they are being hit by Chinese sanctions and economic sanctions and export controls. So I think priorities should be given to those sectors that understand this effort. It's massive. A lot of work needs to go in there. So it will be very helpful to identify, specific sectors to focus most of our resources on.
So
and
Huan,
then,
thanks for that really extensive set of comments and elaboration of what the Biden administration has done. I'm still waiting for you to grade us. What grade would you assign?
the Biden administration?
Yes, in some ways, right? I'm asking, grade us, those of us in our recommendations in the first cohort, right? Because what the Biden administration has followed through is essentially the recommendations of the first cohort. So what grade would you assign?
I grade your efforts, your publications 100%. I really enjoy the recommendations. I agree with them. If I were in the Biden administration, I would have adopted them. So let me stop there.
Okay, I will say I did not, we did not coordinate on this. I did not in any way shape this whatsoever. Martin, agree or disagree? And elaborate a little bit further. How would you grade both the Biden administration's efforts, but also the set of recommendations that came out 4 years ago that were largely followed through?
Yeah, so I think largely the difficulties have been the implementation side, and in the trade side, I would rate at a much lower level. I think there were too many contradictions in the policies that were followed through, but I'll just go kind of bit by bit. So in terms of promoting US's competitiveness and building out the US industrial base, huge success there in terms of the CHIPS Act, and really far more successful. I've done some research looking at the amount of private investment that has been spurred in that area, and some of the most advanced, you look at the success that TSMC has had in Arizona, for example, I think it's beyond expectations. So that's an A. In the IRA example, I think the climate group here of the fellows is probably a little bit less sanguine about our ability to become really competitive in green. So I think they're maybe a little bit less successful. In the trade area, I think much of the rest of the world is very frustrated that the Biden administration didn't really want to agree to any new trade rules, and really just kind of waited to talk about improving the WTO until the last minute, just kind of threw up its hands and kept it shackled by not supporting the dispute settlement system. So I think trade would be a very low grade at this point. But then in terms of protecting from China, I think it's also somewhat mixed, but in part due to no fault of the administration or your recommendations. I think that the Congress has not provided enough funding for the export control system, which has been tasked with this gigantic unfunded mandate to try to protect all sorts of new areas of technology and really advance circumvention efforts by Russia and China. But I think despite that, they've been actually quite successful and have held back China in certain ways. Now, whether that will actually last, whether that's led to the development of other capabilities, I think we'll get into a little bit later. But I'd say overall, decently positive grade outside of trade.
Great. Thanks for that, Martin and Zoe.
I would echo what Juan and Martin earlier mentioned, but in addition to that, I wanted to just highlight, in terms of the protecting America's economic security. I think that's the part where your recommendations in terms of working with allies, working with U.S. partners has really reached a highlight because, for a long period of time, folks talk about economic security, but it was actually not until very recently during the G7 meeting in summit in Tokyo that people highlighted what does economic security mean, and included the critical mineral supply chain in the conversation of economic security. So from that point of view, I do think that's really a highlight, and congratulations to your recommendation being put through.
Well, I should note then, however, there remain, and I think as captured by President Trump's rhetoric on the campaign trail, there remain significant trade and competitiveness challenges with regards to China. I've made reference already to the second China shock, but I think also the complexity of the tools that are being used for economic statecraft has also expanded dramatically, and that's particularly in the wake of the Ukraine conflict as well. So what I want to do now is, having taken a look back at the last 4 years, I want to focus on your papers and particularly your recommendations to the Trump administration and what needs to be done over the next 4 years. And here again, maybe Juan, let me start with you. And one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is China has built out its regime of sanctions and counter-sanctions in response to these tools being used in a much more fervent manner by the United States and its allies. It has also threatened to put more firms on these various regimes, and we've seen these over the last couple of months actually been brought to bear. For a while, people just thought these were just frameworks sitting there, but now we're seeing these are actually tools that are being used. This is not something that was addressed very much 4 years ago, but it's very much at the forefront of the debate today. What are the key things that we should know about China's economic sanctions and counter-sanctions regimes? And what do you believe to be sort of the key recommendations that the Trump administration ought to follow through over the next 4 years?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yes, you're absolutely correct. The tension on Chinese economic sanctions and extra controls were not that much 4 years ago, but it really, since 2019 and 2010, we just saw a rapid development of this legal framework within China. So my paper touch upon mainly 4 pillars of this legal system that includes export control law, anti-foreign sanctions law, provisions on the unreliable entity list, and the rules on a justified extraterritorial application of foreign legislation. So I would say that you're absolutely correct in pointing out that China, in designing its legal system, legal framework, really look at what the US and other Western countries have done in the area, and has adopted a lot of similar features that we're seeing in the US, economic sanction systems. Just give you one example, they have this. US has multi-pillar structure for its economic sanctions. We have, different sanction lists for different, objectives, policy objectives, and China has started doing the same. And there are, many other, similarities as well. But we are seeing there are some, China characteristics in its own legal system. And I think it's very important for the US to, realize that and realize there's room for the US to come in and try to influence this process of China developing its, legal framework. So in my paper, I made 3 recommendations. So one, I think the US should dedicate more resources to track and analyze China's evolving sanction framework. And as you mentioned, not a lot of attention were paid to this area, but I think right now what we should really up our resources to do that. And then I think the US should improve on its own sanction system to not only just that will make our own system more effective, but also, I said, setting up a good example for China to follow suit. And then the third part of my recommendation would be the US should prioritize multilateral efforts in this regard, not only in building its own sanctions policy, but also in forming up strategies to, respond to Chinese measures.
Great, thank you for that, Huan. Martin, I'm going to shift over to you. Your paper is on export controls, and export controls have certainly moved along with tariffs, right, to the forefront of thinking about the trade competitiveness agenda in the U.S.-China relations. They're certainly amongst the elements that Chinese policymakers most complain about. But you've already alluded to the fact that given how much they've been employed as a tool, perhaps we haven't scaled up our infrastructure to implement export controls nearly as widely as we should have. So I just want to invite you to perhaps elaborate a bit more on not just that point itself, but what else you think ought to be done to build out the US's use of export controls in response to managed strategic competition with China.
Sure. So I think there's now a bipartisan consensus that more resources are needed for the export control system. If you look at what they were doing in 2019, this is before we put any export controls on Huawei, before we were trying to control the entire chip ecosystem, before we were trying to control all sorts of exports from all around the world. And I think as the Department of Governmental Efficiency looks at where the government can be much more effective and more efficient with the resources it already has, one of the best investments you can make is in upgrading the IT infrastructure of the Bureau for Industry and Security at Commerce, where export controls are designed and implemented. And that's beneficial for 2 reasons. One is you want to be able to automate a lot of things that are currently very human intensive. And that includes things like just the basic giving of licenses. That you can automate that and then focus the resources more intently on actually trying to deconstruct, say, Russian and Chinese circumvention networks. But they can't do it right now because the data systems are so old and don't work very well, so they can't use the new techniques for that. And secondly, it also helps the competitiveness of U.S. industry. If you can get a really quick response back on a kind of routine license, you can make that export faster. You don't have to spend as much time trying to figure out if you get that license, if you make that approved. So it's both beneficial to U.S. industry without any detriment to security, and it's better for governmental efficiency as well. So that's one point. You also want to have the technical capacity to actually figure out how do I design a control that's going to hit China where they have a choke point and not somewhere where you're just going to deprive a U.S. firm of revenue. Another one, a recommendation is realizing that, the United States has a relatively small number of technologies that only we produce. And so you have to work with other countries, whether you like it or not. And you can try to force them, but without enforcement capability, that's not going to work very well. The current multilateral system for coordinated controls is pretty broken. It's kind of been patched up, but it's been broken by Russia. And we need a new system that's able to function much better and add functionality as we aim at China, not just for kind of dual-use military goods, but also more broader and strategically. And then the third element is really focusing on controls and making them dynamic. One of the things that undermines the effectiveness of controls is if you try to control things that are old, no longer at the cutting edge, easily buyable from somewhere else. That's not useful for the US because those lines can't be held. So I kind of argue that we should be really focused and small yard high fence, continue to hit the areas where we can actually build a fence and control the technology and not try to control a bunch of older things. And that's also beneficial for US industry as well. So I think there are a lot of areas to make improvements that don't involve trading off security and economic growth.
Martin, I'm just going to ask one follow-up question of you because I think on many people's minds this week is the development of DeepSeek. And so how should folks viewing this webinar think about this development? Is this something that inevitably would happen regardless? Was this a failure in terms of how the export controls were implemented? Is this just one side devoting its resources to run faster? How should we think about the technological developments that we've seen, particularly in AI in China this week? But also we've seen these advances in other fields that involve technology as well, despite the fact that the export controls have been more robust than they've ever been over the last 4 years.
Yeah, well, there's certainly been a gigantic explosion of takes by people who don't understand AI or export controls, pronouncing immediately about that this means that export controls have failed. There's a lot that we don't know, but I'll kind of give you a response based on what we do know. DeepSeek says that it trained this model on substantially less computing power than many comparable US models. If you look at the chips that they say they trained it on, those are chips that are no longer allowed to be sold to China, but were allowed to be sold to China at the beginning. And this gets into the like really technical nitty-gritty. They found a way to kind of go deep into the hardware and make some really unique hardware and software changes that allowed them to kind of end run the controls. And already before DeepSeek came out with this, the US updated its control and said, oops, we set the speed limit too high. We need to actually change the way that controls are done. So there's kind of the controls effect you see with the lag. And I think one of the things it means is the idea that we, by controlling access to computing, are going to deprive China from the ability to have relatively advanced AI systems, maybe not at the frontier. DeepSeek is not at the frontier, by the way, on its capabilities. US firms are still ahead. But the idea that we can keep them really far behind, I think, has to go out the window, no matter what we try to control. And the second is that anytime you put controls on, firms will try to adapt around it. And that's exactly what we saw that I mentioned earlier. They tried to get around these caps, and that can lead to the development of new capabilities. It doesn't mean that the controls have backfired, but it does mean that it's just hard in a dynamic area. A smart, well-resourced adversary is going to manage to work around some of those controls. So they have to be continually updated and changed to try and stop those circumvention. But also you have to recognize what you can actually control. So there's still a lot that's unknown, but I think we do have to do a lot of free thinking.
Great, thank you for that. Zongyuan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think one of the challenging parts of the Chinese economy is while we have impressive technological feats, not just with regards to AI, we've just discussed, but also with regards to electric vehicles, with regards to a number of other renewable energy sectors. We also have the legacy sectors and the slowing domestic economy in China. And we have perhaps the largest economic headwinds from property deleveraging that's still in the early stages of working its way through the Chinese economy. And this has led to significant overcapacity, not just in what we've thought of as traditional sectors like coal or cement and so forth, but also sectors with significant defense or dual use implications, including steel, including shipbuilding, including batteries, and you name it. And so China has been reluctant to say that it has an overcapacity issue, but I think you mentioned in your paper, whatever you want to call it, there's a problem here. And this is a problem that affects not just the United States, but a number of other allies, but also developing countries that are looking to work its way into global value chains. So how do we address the overcapacity problem, or whatever else the Chinese would like to call this issue that's confronting the global economy today?
Mark, I think you summarized some of my findings way much better than I could have. So thank you very much for reading my paper carefully. The challenge, really, the core to your challenge to China's industrial policy implementation, or as the consequence of which is currently the so-called overcapacity challenge. I think at the core is that the system today, it's still very much a state-led investment and export-oriented economy. And in fact, this model worked very well for a long period of time. Back in the 1970s, China was one of the poorest country in the world. But in the past decade, China became the second largest economy in the world. And if we measure it by PPP terms, China is the largest economy in the world. So from that point of view, I do think that model worked for a while, but now the idea that state-led investment, central government set, these are the sectors that we're going to do, then you end up having each individual provinces may want to move towards that direction. And you also have the state-led, the banking system worked very much towards that goal as well in terms of capital allocation. And local governments also give preferential treatment to companies, not just in terms of with connections, but also companies who have projects that can march towards the goal in strategic sectors. So from that point of view, this kind of a campaign style model is inevitably going to lead to overcapacity. So, to answer your question in terms of how to address it, I do think, one fundamental issue that they need to address is to increase domestic consumption, and in particular, the household consumption part. And then on top of that, series of administrative changes need to be implemented, especially in terms of solving the mobility issue, reform the hukou or the household registration, and it also needs to rethinking how local government, what the role of local government in terms of managing or coordinate among each other. And right now, it's the lack of coordination among provinces is literally by design. But I think recently, in December Central Economic Conference, party chief has talked about the necessity of increased coordination, central local coordination. I think there are different ways to interpret that. If the increased coordination means better resource allocation among different provinces, that's great. But if increased coordination means a further top-down control, that might not necessarily be the way we want the way benefited the Chinese economy.
So, Zongyuan, I'm going to ask a follow-up question there as well. Much of what you've emphasized was emphasized by the Biden administration, in particular by Secretary Yellen in the bilateral dialogues that she had with her counterparts, most notably He Feng. Looking at where we are today, would you look at this as a half glass full? Like everyone just needs to be patient, but this is a problem that's on its way to being solved, and how do we deal with the after effects? Or how long will it take? Or would you agree with President Trump saying this got too few results, and therefore a much more hard-headed approach needs to be taken to push China to make these changes much faster or face a set of consequences?
This is a great question. I think the timing is something that I don't think China right now can afford, in the sense that not just in terms of the local government debt problem, but also demographic. So in many ways, the timing is not necessarily on the Chinese government side. But I think I would caution against increased or even tougher position on China, whether it is trade or it is or any other issues. Part of the reason is because a lot of China's self-sufficiency drive is sort of a reaction to perceived deteriorating international environment. So changes in or further deterioration in the bilateral relationship or heightened geopolitical tensions may further convince Chinese leaders to see, we need to double down on self-sufficiency. And in fact, we also see this happening at the firm level as well. I remember last summer when I visited Shenzhen, talked with some tech entrepreneurs. I asked them the part, to what extent the decoupling, de-risking narrative has or has not affected their business. And, two people specifically mentioned to me that, one, as a result of not just the Huawei ZTE, but also the narrative of China is US pacing threat or strategic, or maybe they even recognize that over 80% of Americans view China as enemy. So from that point of view, the tech entrepreneurs, they realize that they don't want to be reliant on either US capital or US supplies. Part of the reason is because once you get access to that, they are afraid of losing it. But if you never have access to it, there is no fear of losing it. So from that perspective, I do think that the Trump administration, probably because of his personality trait, because of he has a firm grip on the Republican Party. So in a way, I think he probably has unique opportunities to redefine US-China relationship.
Right. So in a minute, I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. So for those of you who have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. I'm just going to ask one last question here of all of you. Several of you in your papers have talked about the need to work multilaterally, or at least working with like-minded partners. This is something the Trump administration has sometimes said, you need to get off the fence. You need to actually just make clear you're either with us, and if you're not with us, you're going to see a set of consequences there as a result. This is a rhetoric that I think rings very true to those who have suffered the economic consequences over the last decade or more, whether we're talking about auto workers in the US or auto workers more recently in Germany who have faced layoffs and who will be heading to the polls in 3 weeks. So I'm wondering or asking, how important is this you need to pick a side type of strategy here in terms of getting those who are hedging or getting those who are seeking to be neutral to come off the fence? Do you support that type of approach here? Do you think that's going to be counterproductive for the United States? And if you think that's going to be counterproductive, and one just needs to be patient given where China's own interests are, what do you say to the person who is facing the economic consequences or the backlash of all this as a result of whether we're talking about subsidies, whether we're talking about overcapacity, or whether we're talking about a set of sanctions that have been put in place or market access controls and so forth? What policies does one offer then to appease those voters? I'll open up for whoever wants to take a first crack at that question.
I can take a first crack at that. So, because I've looked a lot in detail at the way that the US has tried to convince other countries in the export control space. And I think the fundamental premise that there will be, one side or the other is just unrealistic even to the most biggest security ally. And if you look at what the US has done, the US continues to trade with China more and more. Despite all the tariffs, despite all of the de-risking and all those things, the US has not said we are only going to be an island that has no connection to China. So it's unrealistic to ask others to do the same. I think what we can do is say, here is an area where there's a real security concern. Are you with us on this security concern? And there we've had a little bit more success, but I think that's also been mixed. So I think we have to be clear what our actual priorities are when we're talking to these countries. If we tell them, don't buy anything from China, they'll have rampant inflation. And we tell them don't sell anything to China, then their companies are going to go bust. So, that's not a very attractive proposition. And the attractiveness of the US market and US technology is great, but it only goes so far. So if you're thinking about what kind of policies can help, I think one side is to say we need a lot more integration where we have an economic offer. If we're trying to ask them to impose economic costs on themselves by either not selling from China or not buying from China, there needs to be something on offer on the other side of that makes that palatable for the either the sectors or companies or individuals who are the losers from that. But also, recognizing that there's a big collective action problem here, and sometimes pushing allies hard to go along with us and forcing them to make a tough choice can be beneficial, including in giving them kind of protection from Beijing, where if they can tell Beijing, look, we wanted to continue to do this with you, but the US has tied our hands.
Juan or Zoe, would you like to weigh in?
I'll go. In terms of working with allies, I think this is not necessarily the moment where allies or partners would want to choose or pick a side, but they recognize the need. And if not, perhaps the threat of sanctions, the threat of at least a tariff is going to go up. So from that point of view, I think probably a diversified supply chain for companies and for government to work among themselves to sort of developing an alternative multilateral partnership to hedge against U.S. isolationism probably is not a bad idea. But I'm not exactly sure how far that can go, given President Trump's his tendency to change, but also his willingness to even walk back some of the stuff that he said himself earlier. So I guess diversification is the word that I would use. Thank you, Mark.
So I would just add to it. I agree with Martin and Zoe. I do feel like the U.S. right now, President Trump tend to use tariffs as a negotiation tactic, or and also the rudder of pick a side. I think that may work on some partners and allies just because they share this security interests with the US. But when it comes to other countries that are not traditional allies of the US, that may not work because, as Martin pointed out, that other countries need to have investments, they need to have trade. So in those sense, that I think carrots will work better for the US than sticks. So one way is make use of trade agreements, either bilateral or prolateral, that will strongly deliver some economic interests and benefits for those countries. We're trying to caution to don't get too cozy with Chinese products.
So I want to invite those in the audience. I don't see any questions so far, so I'll continue with my line of questioning. But I do want to invite those of you on the webinar, if you have questions, to feel free to weigh in. Actually, we just had a question come in from Alexander Koblinski. Who in specific do you think will be the big losers and winners globally of the Trump administration's pick a side mindset? We saw Southeast Asia and Vietnam be big beneficiaries during the Biden administration with bamboo diplomacy. Do you think that strategy will sort of lose its effectiveness in the Trump administration? Who do you see as sort of the winners given the Trump approach and its difference with the Biden administration?
I think Southeast Asia will continue to be a winner. They will face some challenges because the Trump administration is almost certainly going to try to go after Chinese inputs that are going into things that are then exported to the United States from Southeast Asia. So they may be forced to do a little bit more choosing, but at the same time, there will be so much flood of Chinese investment trying to get out and get around tariffs that I suspect they'll continue to gain quite substantially. And frankly, many of these activities that people are trying to move out of China can't really go anywhere else in terms of capacity or and cost competitiveness. A lot of manufacturing just is not going to be able to go back to the US or into advanced economies. I think Europe is going to continue to struggle quite substantially. They're already, facing major economic challenges from competition from China, overcapacity in China that's hollowing out important industries. You mentioned autos earlier. I think even if they're able to protect their market from Chinese EVs, they're going to lose markets outside of Europe, and so that's going to be a big negative shock to much of the economy that's based on exports, especially in Germany. And it's not clear what they have to replace it. And I suspect the Trump team will also do some imposition of some tough measures on Europe that will deepen their challenges. And probably the U.S. and China will both suffer from the competitive measures and counter retaliation that go back and forth.
Juan, anything you'd like to add? In terms of winners and losers from moving much more towards a pick a side type of strategy, or you're with us or you're against this type of strategy?
I don't think there will be clear winners because both of them are, both US and China are big economies. If you choose the side, you will lose some other, either market share or revenue or, investment or capital. So I don't think there are clear winners. The question is who's going to lose more. So I think in that sense, I guess depending on how President Trump can, get to his negotiation with, different parties and see who can actually reach a deal with the Trump administration at what cost. So I'll stop there.
So again, I'll invite our audience members, if you have additional questions, please feel free to weigh in. Let me ask a question right now that gets much more tactical, right? So we are looking at the possibility that 10% tariffs will get imposed in a few days. And on the campaign trail, we heard talk of 60% tariffs against China and possibly use of other blanket tariffs against countries whose policies did not align with those interests of the United States. Where do you expect us to be a year from now, if you have any predictive powers? Or if you don't want to speculate, what is it that you're looking at most specifically as you try to read the tea leaves of where we're headed?
I would say, as an economist, I feel like I have a bit of a crystal ball here because the effects of tariffs are pretty predictable and were quite predictable during the first Trump term as well. On areas where tariffs were imposed, prices went up, and the effects of the predicted effects that we might have based on economic models of tariffs in terms of you put tariffs on, you're likely to lead to an appreciation of the dollar, depreciation of the currency of the country that's hit with tariffs. That's all pretty expected. And so I suspect what I'm looking at is, there's all this ambition and I think this fantastical thinking so far, at least that they publicly say among Trump and his team about, well, tariffs won't cause any inflation. And one of the things we know that's extremely politically costly these days is inflation. Pretty much every incumbent administration everywhere in the world has lost in large part due to frustrations over inflation. And I suspect that many people voted for Trump with the idea that they wanted an end to inflation that they blamed on the Biden administration. So if Trump comes in and he has his tariff ideas and it turns out that the economists are right, and the people in his administration who fantastically say that they won't lead to inflation are wrong, then it'll be interesting to see if they decide to push forward and argue that the medium-term benefits, as they see them, to U.S. industry in terms of creating capacity are worth continued imposition of those tariffs, or if the inflation, when it actually begins to hit Americans' wallets and the competitiveness of U.S. firms that use inputs end up swamping that, maybe they decide to back down and scale back. We've already seen a lot of threats scaled back, so we'll just have to see if the negative impacts, both in terms of market prices and also in inflation, lead them to scale back some of these things and realize maybe this plan is not going to work.
So by judging from what happened during the first Trump administration, I would say that within the first year, we're probably going to see a lot of back and forth negotiation, communication between the Trump administration and Beijing. I think the 60% tariffs gives Trump a very good leverage to start negotiations, and whether that will eventually get imposed or what the tariff rates will be, down the road, really depending on negotiations between the Trump government, the Trump administration, and the Chinese government. I also want to highlight that there is this push, not just within the Trump administration, but also on the Hill in Congress to raise tariffs on Chinese goods. There are efforts going through regarding the de minimis threshold. There are also bills introduced and reintroduced on the Hill about revoking China's permanent normal trade relations status. And there are different proposals out there about what kind of tariff rates should be imposed on Chinese imports. So I think when we look at the big picture, it's important to know that what President Trump has in mind, but also to be aware of what's going on in Congress and the push there to increase tariffs and on Chinese goods that could also become something that has more profound impact on bilateral trade.
Okay, thank you both. So there's a question from Arthur Krober. Arthur takes issue, Huan, with your assessment of the Trump and Biden administration's trade policies, a bit more aligned with Martin's viewpoint, in the sense that these tariff policies have failed in all of their objectives. They haven't cut the trade deficit, either globally or with China. They haven't reduced U.S. reliance on Chinese imports on a value-added basis, and they've actually led to a decrease, at least for a while, in terms of U.S. manufacturing investment and employment, although we've seen a bump after the pandemic. Arthur also takes issue, Martin, with your grades in terms of the positive assessment of the export control regimes, contending that they've accelerated incentives not only of the Chinese state, but also of individual Chinese companies to find ways to innovate around those controls. So to that extent, they haven't necessarily been effective, but perhaps have spurred Chinese innovation, or at least given that the Trump administration is likely to double down on both export controls as well as the failed tariff strategy. Isn't it the case that the United States is going to further damage its own reindustrialization efforts, raise costs, simply enhance China's innovation incentives, and in the process, torch goodwill with potential allies and partners? So Arthur's question to you all is, if the aim here is really to reindustrialize the U.S. in key areas, why isn't your core policy recommendation one of abandoning tariffs and export controls in favor of a positive strategy of industrial investment?
You want to go first, Juan? Because I've been going first on the questions.
I can't speak for Martin why he formed his recommendations that way, but for me, it's politically challenging to actually make it happen that the U.S. should abandon its export control, measures. Don't just feel like the stake is too high. There are too many forces from different angles they're pushing for, so it would be unrealistic to do so. And I think Zoe make more recommendations in terms of industrial policies, and at least my paper really focused on legal system of sanctions. So that just seems I should focus. The recommendations also focus on these areas.
Okay, well, I can take tariffs and this then. I don't particularly support many of the tariff policies of the Biden administration. I suspect one of the issues they had in trying to sell their strategy, as opposed to Trump's, was that, well, if tariffs are so bad, then why did you keep all of the Trump tariffs and impose more? I agree with Arthur's assessment of the fact that the tariffs were not really very successful. And the one wrinkle I would say is there are some people who think that that tariffs help protect the U.S. from this gigantic wave of overcapacity and surging EV imports in particular, which I think is the one area which has some merit. In terms of the export control policy, I think you have to think about a few factors. One is that the Trump administration really started with a very entity-specific kind of regulation where they said, this is a bad company, maybe it's contributing to Chinese military modernization or enabling human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Therefore, we need to hit them with an entity listing that cuts them off from everything. And then the Biden administration continued that policy, but also added a layer, which was we're going to control this specific technology that we're worried about rather than this specific entity. And no one in China can buy this technology. So even if you're not a specifically called out firm, you can't buy this technology. And I actually think, somewhat heretically, that just kind of willy-nilly adding every Chinese company that's successful in many areas to the entity list has led, and I think there's good evidence of that, as you say, that has led to there being a designing out of the United States that could, in the end, be negative. And what I worry about going forward, one of the reasons I'm saying draw lines that you can actually enforce, is I suspect if we overreach, we lead to companies all around the world saying, okay, if I use US technology or US inputs, then even a small amount, then the US is going to say, we have the right to tell you who you can sell that to. And now if that's just Huawei, that's one thing. But if it's, many hundreds of companies or entire swaths of China's economy, then suddenly, okay, the US input is a little bit better, but am I willing to use US inputs if that's the result? And so I've been trying to track exactly this. How much has there been a designing out of US components around the world? Even in the semiconductor space, one of the interesting things is we don't really see that showing up in the data yet. We don't, for example, see, the China revenue share of US semiconductor firms going down and foreigners going up necessarily, in part because this is just a really complicated area. But you hear a lot of anecdotes about it, and it might begin to show up in the data later. So that's why I think we do have to be very careful about it, but I don't think we should just abandon the whole thing. In part, it's due to the fact that once you've pushed that button, I don't think you can walk back. I don't think the US government can make a credible case to Chinese companies now. We're not going to add any more to the entity list. Don't worry, you can keep buying from us. It'll all be fine. I don't think they're going to buy it anymore. I think the Biden team came in and made that decision, and they said, we have already tipped them up and they're going to try to indigenize as much as possible. And therefore we have to keep going with here. So even if we think it's not the best policy, I think to some extent we are kind of stuck with it.
Martin, one last question to you before we wrap up. This question comes from Katniss Lee, and she asks, if the administration does follow through on your recommendation to allocate more resources for enforcement of export controls, which U.S. domestic actors, such as manufacturing companies, workers, tech giants, startups, and so forth, which ones stand to win and which ones stand to lose? And should the domestic constituents' interests factor at all in terms of how these strategies are then set? So if you just give a quick answer on that question.
Yeah, I think anyone who has to currently comply with export controls would honestly be better off with the modernized BIS infrastructure. The ones who are most likely lose would be Russia, China, Iran, everybody who likes the fact that the BIS can't really track who's ordering what because it takes them multiple days to even just do a basic data query. So in terms of industries, it's hard to think that many would necessarily lose. Maybe in the semiconductor space, you could say if they have their own capacity, they might need to lean less on industry, and therefore industry might have a little less influence on what they end up controlling. But in general, I think it'd be an unalloyed positive.
Well, I just want to extend my thanks both to you as well as to Huan, as well as to Zoe, who had to leave a few minutes early because she has a class. I think that this has been a fascinating conversation. Hopefully, it's given folks a lot of food for thought, but also reasons to read your papers in depth. Nathan, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mark. What a fantastic granular conversation. I learned so much. I'm very grateful to Mark for moderating far deeper in these weeds than myself, certainly, but many others that I know, and that was reflected in your questioning. And thank you, of course, to Martin and Juan and Zoe for not only participating in this webinar, but for all the work you've done for the project and your great papers. Those who are on the Zoom will have seen the links to the papers, but those who will be watching this either on YouTube now live or later, just go to our website of the Penn Project and the Future of U.S.-China Relations and the policy paper side, and you will find the papers that are still working papers that are under discussion today, as well as the other papers of the other groups that have begun to be published in this period of time. We will be publishing every week through the end of February. Next week, we will be publishing the technology papers. For those of you who are, as many I know, are obsessed with the DeepSeek story, we will be as timely as we can be with the technology discussion, same time, same place next week, and then all the way through the end of February. Thank you once again. Wonderful conversation, and look forward to the next one.